Speaking of Stafford and speaking of, you mentioned injury histories here a couple minutes ago. I believe you went back and looked at almost every NFL player's injury history, and I think you
Mhm.
compiled a list. What what prompted you to do that? Because I think, and don't take this the wrong way, I think most normal people probably wouldn't sit down on a Friday night and be like, you know what, tonight I just want to go through and look at everyone's injury history. So please tell us that story.
So that was yep. That happened in 2021, somewhere around there. It was in the off season, probably I'd say February, March, and I'm like, and then I started looking at. So basically, what I did was I took every relevant NFL quarterback that was active, every running back, wide receiver, tight end. I didn't do like the fourth string running backs. Like I had a line because it was just getting ridiculous. But I basically, because my primary issue at that time was, how can I project someone's future risk if I don't know what injuries they've had? Obviously, we'll never know all the injuries a player has. It's just not realistic. Many of them aren't even discussed. Players that come to me, I don't have to report to anyone. No one knows what that injury is except for the player and me. So that type of thing would never show up on an injury report. But if they were on an injury report in the NFL for insurance reasons, they have to be on the report, namely other things. But um, there's a reason they were dealing with something. Even if it wasn't enough to keep them out of the game, that means they were still dealing with something. And sometimes they'll say like knee/rest, and those I don't really comment on because they're basically saying we're giving this guy off. But in general, I wanted to identify as many things as I can because each of those plays a role in future injuries and future. I'll give an example. Anthony Richardson this year. Um, Came in and really no one knew his history a whole lot. He had an insane medical history. He had multiple injuries to his throwing shoulder going back to his high school years. And the problem with the shoulder is that the location of the shoulder where he injured is scar tissue, all scar tissue. So while yes, he could throw because it would heal, that scar tissue was never as strong as the original ligaments. So when he landed hard on his shoulder, most people who have never had injured their shoulder, maybe a type 1, maybe a little bit of a type 2, and he probably would have missed a couple weeks at the most, and he would have came back. But because his injury to his shoulder was so already significant, those ligaments were already so patchwork. Once he put that shoulder to the ground, he got drove into the ground. He fully tore everything. That was it. And you could have rolled the dice, but it wasn't worth the risk. You had to basically repair him at that time. Now, if you didn't know about his injury history, you would say, "Well, that's just dumb luck." It wasn't dumb luck. There was a writing on the wall, and everything just happened to play out in a certain scenario, and he had a higher risk of re-injury, just like Julio Jones and his hamstrings or Debo and his hamstrings. There's certain players that have a significant history of one or two, or Christian Watson for that matter, uh, that these guys just have had specific issues with certain body parts, and they're known to re-injure that body part. So I wanted to take the guesswork out of it, and I just literally went crazy. And the good thing is I really don't have to add a whole lot because there's only so many players that get added on each year. It's hard, 5, 10, 15 years ago because they didn't have to do a lot of reporting. The internet really didn't exist. There wasn't really a whole lot on paper. There wasn't good reporters asking great questions, and there's 20 reporters for each team, so you get a little bit of a different answer from each of them, and now you can kind of piece it together. Um, but over the past 5 or 8 years or so, they've been much better questions, which allows me to interpret those answers and say, well, he describes it this way. This is likely what it is. Rarely do they say, yes, this is a type 2 AC sprain, which is what Jamar Chase had a couple of weeks ago. But usually it's more, hey, it's this. He can't go this week, but he's okay. He's not going to be a month. Then you can kind of figure out and read between the lines. But when you build that injury history, and we have my company, the Fantasy Doctors, has the most extensive one, you kind of get an idea of how risky. Obviously, there's fluky injuries that happens, but in general, you can see this guy's had 15 injuries and he's missed one game. Like he dude fights through injuries, and then you have guys that have 8 injuries and they've missed 20 games. So you're like, yeah, this guy has a tendency to miss games regardless of the injury. Elijah Mitchell is a guy that comes to mind. Rashad Penny.
Right. How much weight do you think, let's say hypothetically you were able to give out a copy of your injury history report to every team in the NFL. And so now every team is looking at what you've compiled and they're sitting there and they're saying, well, listen, let's say you were the Colts before they drafted Anthony Richardson. Like, listen, this guy has had multiple shoulder injuries. He's had multiple injuries throughout his career. Maybe we should rethink this pick. From your perspective, like, how much weight do you think teams should place on injury histories? You mentioned that there's outliers on either end of the spectrum, maybe somebody
Yeah.
who, typically plays through injuries, but it seems like that there's a correlation between the history and then being able to predict future injuries and availability.
There's a little bit of a loose one, yes. I'll give you two examples. One that's upcoming that's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, and another one that has already played out and has had a very interesting NFL career. Deshaun Watson tore his ACL coming out of college, tore it almost 2 years later, the other side. So was he at higher risk? Yes, and he showed that. Obviously he was high risk, and now he's had a couple of crazy injuries, obviously, in addition to his other stuff. And now you have another player that's about to come out, presumably, Michael Penix, that has a crazy injury history. So it'll be interesting to see how much they take that into consideration. Um, I'll give you another example that kind of has flown under the radar, but when you look at it, you may say, there may be something to that. Zach Wilson tore his labrum in his throwing shoulder pretty bad when he was at BYU. I know he had it repaired and he came back and he looked good in his whatever year, last year he was there. Is it possible that that is somehow impacting him at the NFL? Maybe, I don't know. But there's, you know, there's different injuries that play a role. Drew Brees was the one that defied the odds with the crazy shoulder injury that no one ever thought was going to have make it. Adrian Peterson obviously defied the odds with his crazy knee, but it's been 15, almost 10 years, actually 13 years since then, and we've only had one or two guys actually do good as an NFL running back after an ACL tear. Brees Hall did it this year, and that was the first one that comes to mind. Saquon didn't do well. Dalvin Cook didn't do well. So it's been a long time. Like, you can see most of these guys have a tendency to struggle after XYZ injuries. Why do certain injuries to certain positions really struggle? Look at the Achilles for running backs. They've all been awful. The only one that's been relatively decent is Donta Foreman, and he took 4 years to come back. That's insane. That's a lifetime. The only other one that's been half decent is actually Justice Hill, kind of flown underneath the radar. But like, has James Robinson done well? No, he's on what, 3 or 4 teams already. Cam Akers tore his other side. I don't think it was the same side. I think it was the other side. So it's like there's certain injuries that are like, and then there was a kid coming out of Minnesota last year, running back. I forgot his Muhammad Ibrahim, I think it was, who had tore his Achilles, did absolutely nuclear in his last year there, but no one even bothered with him. Whether it was because he wasn't talented or because they were concerned about the ability of that Achilles to hold up, I don't know. But I think the more information, and most of the stuff that I have should be available. I mean, whatnot. But in general, it at least gives them more informed decisions. I don't know if they're using it to that extent, and they should be, because these picks are very valuable. You miss a guy like Puka Nacua. I mean, you're like, what? How do they miss that guy? Like, he was ridiculous. But if you look at the stats and you pull out and you highlight the analysis, you're like, yeah, the dude belonged up in that tier. He just didn't get that way, and the Rams got a steal, literally. But it should be a significant component. But the problem is, I look at injuries differently. I'm not a surgeon. I don't look at them surgically. I look at them from compensation patterns, from um, how is that injury, and because I study this stuff so much, I understand how it impacts them. they may look at it from a perspective of, hey, can he play tomorrow, or is he still going to be semi-effective? Maybe, but that may not be the right way to look at it. What if I told you he's going to lose 5 or 10%, and that may make him from an elite number one first-round player to a third-round pick? What if I told you that Kirk Cousins, because he tore his Achilles on his power side, is going to have trouble throwing the ball with velocity compared to Aaron Rodgers, who's on his non-throwing or non-dominant side and is probably going to be fine? Same injury. Rodgers is obviously a little bit older, but one may actually struggle a little more than the other, and to most people who you ask, you'd be like, oh, they're going to do fine. He's going to be fine. But what if he doesn't, and you just sunk 25, 30, 35, $40 million into him?
I love
So
this insight.
that,
Yeah.
that's the tricky part, is that, like, and I have people that I kind of sometimes ask this question. I'm like, stop by your friendly orthopedic surgeon and ask them about XYZ injury in the middle of the NFL season. They're going to look at you like you got four heads. Unless they happen to be a diehard fan of the team that you happen to be asking about, there's no way they're going to have good insight. They'll give you some brief general comment, but they're not going to be like, well, yeah, he practiced today. He has a history of missing 3 games with this injury. This team is very aggressive in their approach. He's going to play on Sunday. There's no way. There's no way they would say that, just because it's very hard to keep up with this stuff. It's very difficult to understand which teams are aggressive, i.e. the Eagles, and which teams are conservative, i.e. the Packers. And when you start to use these little tidbits of information, yes, he might be on the field, but he's going to be a decoy. His prop bet should be under. It's not worth the risk. So you start looking at it from a different perspective, and then you start to see it gets complicated, because it's not just one player. My list on average during the season is 75 to 80 players, and I'm not covering any defensive players or any offensive line. It's just wide receiver, tight end, running back, and quarterback. That's it. And then I'm not even covering the 5th string running back that's on special teams. So this stuff is insane, and it's complicated. There's a lot of moving parts, and you have to seek out trends. You have to understand biases. You have to understand just how certain players function. How I can say, yeah, Mike Evans is going to play this week, and I don't even need to see what the injury is unless it's a concussion, because that's just who he is. Whereas another player, I'm like, I don't know, but we're going to have to monitor the practice and go from there, because I know how Mike Evans and how some of these guys are. DeAndre Hopkins came back this year after a confirmed high ankle sprain, didn't miss one game, didn't miss a single game. I knew he was going to struggle for about 2-3 weeks, and he did, but he didn't miss a game because that's who he is. So when you can spot these things and their injury histories, you can identify some of these things. But unfortunately, it is exhausting. It is a significant amount of work, and you really have to be passionate about it, because most people aren't going to be willing to spend that much time week in and week out